I'm back with Victor Smetacek today. And today we will be talking about OIF, and we will try to model out what could happen with OIF in the future based on quantified data in Nature published experiments that Victor did in the past. In fact, I believe it's almost 20 years old. So in my point of view, we lost way too much time. And in my point of view, we should restart these experiments, and hopefully by asking additional questions to Victor's great presentation at Uni Bremen about the topic, we can inspire scientists, governments, and funders around the world to look into OIF again. And hopefully we can give them some good input for future experiments. So what I would love to dive in today with Victor is the starting point of building up the patch. And from what I understood, the input rate of iron to carbon was at a minimum 15,000 tons. So just a single ton of iron created 15,000 tons of biomass. And then I would love to explore what happens afterwards once those algae grow. We can look at a picture of an algae here in my background, but obviously other algae grew at this point. I'd love to understand, Victor, in the buildup of, I think this is EIFEX or EIFEX or whatever example you want to give, what kind of algae were around at the baseline, how much did they grow, and then what would be maybe the percentage of algae that were stimulated by iron in the patch or outside the patch, and what is the journey of each algae species and what benefits might they have for the biosphere. With that, word to you, Victor.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. The questions that you are asking are biological questions, really, with regard to species. And it's important to remember that the species in the plankton are as different to plant species on land. Within the group, the species behave differently, just like land species behave differently. Pine trees behave differently like oak trees, and they again behave differently to bushes or grasses or whatever. Basically, there are in the plankton two types of strategies available, and they are of great relevance to iron fertilization. If you want to do something with iron fertilization, there are those species that grow up to a certain level, and then they form sort of resting stages. They kind of culminate, and then they sink out. Those are the ones that take a lot of carbon down with them. And these are like deciduous trees, the trees that shed their leaves. So that's one gang of species. And the other gang of species are those that prefer to stay in the surface layer. They prefer not to sink out. They don't have a mechanism to sink out in large quantities. And we have both of them all over the world. And of course, there are transition species as well. There's some which sink out quantitatively, that means all sink out, and there are others that take only some out, and so on, right? So it's, of course, as in biology, there's a bit of a mess, but there are these extremes. And it depends where you fertilize, and it depends also on the situation. If you were to go to a land ecosystem and that is dried out, which is suffering from drought, and you add water, you pour water over it, then not all the species will respond at that time, because it depends also on their life cycle stage. So some will respond and others will not respond immediately, or they might respond later. We have to understand that this is biology. And biology is driven by evolution, the development of these species, the reasons that they evolve, and also the question of how many of them are eaten. What is their fate? That is also important. And here in the Southern Ocean, the species of interest are diatoms. These are algae that have a shell made out of silica. And silica is basically glass. And that's alga behind you. It's a diatom. It's a freshwater diatom, but they're very similar. And the diatoms are all over the world. They even grow on trees and things like that. So they are universally present. And what you see over here on this particular graph is how the diatoms change when you add them, you give them iron. If you have a plant that is dried out, It has its leaves hanging, it's wilted, it looks bad. You can tell just by looking at it. And the same with the plankton. You can tell by looking at the phytoplankton whether they are thriving or whether they're suffering from a limitation. And here, when you add iron in the ocean and the plankton there is iron limited, then they all start looking up. They start growing plasma, and then they start becoming green, like the alga behind you. That one have had a huge amount of iron, so it's very happy. It's full of green chloroplasts. But in the ocean, in areas like particularly the Southern Ocean, the algae are actually permanently iron limited, because the moment they get iron, they grow up, but then that iron is gone. So then again, they're waiting. They're always limited. And you can easily find out which algae are limited and not by examining them, by examining their photosynthetic reaction. That's possible now. There are instruments with which you can zoom in on one algal cell, and by looking at its response to the light that you give it, you can know, is it suffering or is it healthy? I mean, is it growing? Well, that means you add iron and you see it started to grow. It starts growing. It picks up the iron and starts immediately to incorporate the iron into biomass. We have these tools to do that, to measure how the phytoplankton respond. And that's how we also carried out the experiments. We added the iron, and then we circled around with the ship and looked to see where the patch was based on the response of the algae. It was very, very simple. All right. Now, apart from just growing in the water when they get their iron, the other thing is that the algae are also grazed by a range of different zooplankton, and they can also be hit by viruses. But the reason why diatoms are so successful is because they have hardly any viral pathogens, right? Because the silica shell in which they live has very, very small pores, and viruses cannot enter, and bacteria definitely not. So there are only very few viral pathogens and bacterial pathogens of diatoms. So the main feeders in diatoms are zooplankton, and they crack the shells of the diatoms. They have teeth that also have silica, which is this glass I was telling you about, with which they crush the shells. And this species of zooplankton that is most evolved to feed on diatoms is krill. So there is a relationship between krill, and krill are these euphausids that look like shrimps. They're about this big, and these are copepods. And the krill is also the main food of whales, particularly blue whales. As a matter of fact, blue whales don't eat anything else. They only eat krill. And this is actually very, very surprising. It's very well known. Everybody knows that. I mean, the scientists know that, but they don't go around saying, isn't this strange? Just imagine having elephants that eat only one kind of grass. The elephants also eat brush, they pull branches down, and they eat all kinds of things. Herbivores eat all kinds of things, but blue whales eat only krill, nothing else. And there's some other whales like humpback whales. They also feed on small fish swarms. But blue whales feed only on krill, meaning that there has to be a very tight relationship from the evolutionarily, that the whales could rely on getting their krill. Yeah, this is krill. That they can rely on feeding on krill and build up that biomass that they build up. I mean, these are huge, the largest animals the planet has ever seen. And on one group of crustacea. And in the Southern Ocean, it's only one species. So this reliance on krill already indicates that there must be some way the whales are able to control the availability of krill, that they are, as a matter of fact, they have domesticated the krill the way we have domesticated our livestock, like horses and cows and sheep and so on. Right? There has to be that kind of relationship, that the whales can rely on there being krill when they go down there to feed, and that next year there'll also be krill and so on. So this is what's been going on in the Southern Ocean, that the whales, they feed on the krill. No, okay, I should say the amount of iron in krill varies from individual to individual, can vary a lot. That means they can also pick up a lot of iron and store it, the krill, but they can also have less iron. So there's a big variation. And this has confused scientists because they want to have just one number and they have to give a range. And in my thinking, this is because the krill are able to store iron in large amounts, more than they need. And that's because the whales feeding on the krill release this iron back into the system, and which leads to diatom blooms. So the whales are doing ocean iron fertilization. And that's what they've survived on. That's what they're depending on. And that's why they've built up this huge biomass, not only in terms of individual size, but also globally. You know, the amount of whales out there before they were all killed was huge. And imagine the Industrial Revolution would not have had the ease with which it built up its biomass if it hadn't been for whale oil. That was the blubber that was harvested in the Southern Ocean was a major factor in starting off the Industrial Revolution in the 1920s and 30s. That's why there was such a demand for this whale oil, which is why all the whales were killed. Right? So this whale-krill diatom story, we have to keep that in mind, because what we are doing is we are replicating nature. We are going to do the same that the whales did, and we have become huge in the human biomass. Yeah, we dwarf all the others. And yeah, that's right. This is the diagram showing this relationship as to how the Southern Ocean was so productive in the past that it could maintain the biomass of these giants. And we want to do that again. So what we would like to do, or what we should be doing, the humans who have some sense in their heads, right? We should be going out there, adding iron, mimicking the whales, building up the diatom stocks, and building up the krill stocks also, get the whales back so that they can continue doing their job. And in the beginning, while this is all building up, there would, of course, be a loss of diatoms that would be sinking out on their own, which I will explain shortly. But since the krill biomass today is not very large, it's quite small, as a matter of fact, a lot of the diatoms that we would fertilize with OIF would sink out. But that would be good for the planet because they would be taking carbon down with them. And as then the krill population builds up and this whale-krill relationship stabilizes, then there would be still carbon being sunk. But I should say at the beginning that this is not the hope for climate change, because we are not going to stop climate change with this particular technique. We take carbon out, and it's much more effective and efficient than any other method we have available at the moment, other than planting trees. So that is the situation with the iron. And the whales have exploited this because they have been defecating iron into the water, building up phytoplankton blooms eaten by the krill, and recycled. So we had a system that was maintained by the whales. Now, on land, you cannot think of anything like that, because on land, the plant production is limited by water availability. Right? Here in North Germany, for instance, you don't see that because it's raining most of the time, or it used to at least, with only short periods of drought. But when there is 2 weeks or 3 weeks of drought, then the fields dry up and farmers start complaining and so on, right? But in most of the world, the rainfall is much more sporadic, and that limits the production of biomass by the plant, by land plants. Okay? Water is very bulky. You can't carry water around. So animals are not able to fertilize the plants that they depend on with water because they just can't carry that stuff around, right? So we cannot imagine such a system on land where you have animals, dogs, they lift their leg and pee against bushes, but that's not enough to make the bush happy, provide the water it needs. This situation that an animal population maintains its own food, which is similar to what we humans have been doing since we exploded the population biomass of Homo sapiens, went up after we discovered agriculture. And whales were already agriculturists before we evolved. That you have to remember. So they have evolved to do this, and they've done it very well. That means we can mimic it. We can also do that. So if we want, we can grow krill biomass, right? Because the whales will be feeding not everywhere, they feed in certain areas, but and that's where the production was also very high in these regions. That's mostly in the Atlantic and less in the Pacific. Well, very little actually in the Pacific. By far the bulk was in the Atlantic extending into the Indian Ocean, that corner. And so I would suggest that once we start ocean iron fertilization, we would start there. We would start at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula and then move east, fertilizing as we go along. And that's where the krill is also today. And then we would build up the krill stocks. The whales would come in. We would let them, of course, be very happy and watch them. No?
Rebuilding krill and whale stocks in the Southern Ocean using artificial iron fertilization. Yeah, okay, I'll just go back quickly. This is a joint preparation with Matt Savoca from Stanford, who recently published a paper in Nature, which I helped review. And he and his group, they studied the feeding of whales directly. They put sensors on the whales, and they measured exactly how often the whales opened their mouth and how often they gulped, and then they also measured the krill concentrations where the whales were feeding, and he added that all up, and then he got new values about how much the whales were eating, and there was about double what we had thought up to now. So the whales were eating about double the amount of krill. That was his upper level, but we are now somewhere between what was believed and what is now, and that I'll show you now in this thing. And how it was possible, because those places where the whales were feeding before, those places today are deserts. There's nothing there. Very low phytoplankton concentration, iron limited. But 100 years ago, there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of whales in the Southern Ocean. And how is that possible? Where were they getting their food from, and how was it possible? Now, this is another paper that came out recently. Not another paper, there's a paper, Growth Limitation of Marine Fish by Low Iron Availability in the Open Ocean. So this is the first paper that came out showing that fish stocks are also regulated by the amount of iron availability. But this is just the beginning. Now, here's the Southern Ocean, the physical oceanography, and the ACC, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, is divided into bands. No? And the experiments we carried out were along the polar front, here along this outer one here. But I just showing you this because these bands are going round and round, and the upwelling is along the divergence, the Antarctic zone here, and this is where the nutrients come up, and they go down along the subtropical front, they subduct. And this is where the Antarctic intermediate water is formed. Yeah? So you have also these high nutrient concentrations coming up here, where the squid catches are. And that's where the iron and the nutrients merge, and there you have this huge squid buildup, squid biomass, which are being fished, just to give you an overview. Now, the Southern Ocean also has this sea ice zone around it. This is the sea ice extent. It's going down now. In September 21, no? The average is the pink line. But this area is covered with ice. And in the past, there used to be much more ice over here. This is where the ice is shrinking fastest. And this is what you have in the summer, at the height of the summer. Now you have these remnants of ice. So nobody talks about the summer sea ice in Antarctica. It's also difficult to measure because it's all dispersed. The ice flows are dispersed. And this is then continuous ice. Now, this ice is very important for the krill biology. And in the past, no? So you see, this is the outer extent of the sea ice, and that's where the whales were caught, because the krill was over there. And that from this diagram, this is the whaling grounds from the 1920s and 30s. Right? So if you look at the data, where were the whales killed? Right? Then that's what you get. No? So here's the island of South Georgia, and in October, this is where the whaling was going on. November, December, January, February, March. No? And you can see this coming in. No? Here, this is the ice edge. Here's South Georgia, no? South Georgia here. And now the ice, the place where the whales are being caught is over here. It's going down with the ice. It's following the ice. Okay? Now, if you look at the total amount of whale catches and the blue whale kills before 1930, then they were here. okay? And from 30 to 70s over here. So the few blue whales that have survived are here somewhere in this area. But during the whaling era, this is where the whales were. And where were the krill? This from this map, this is taken from krill surface larvae, 20 to 40, no? And you see here's the peninsula, and here you see where the krill were. The krill larvae were. They were here along the northern boundary of the Weddell Gyre. Now, this is the Weddell Gyre, which is going round and round here. And this is where the krill larvae were. And there's nothing on the Pacific side. It was only concentrated in the Atlantic. Now, I have been there in this area on a cruises with Polarstein before we did the iron fertilization experiments. And this is a cruise we carried out in 1992, and in the spring of 1992. And our cruise track, it went from here, and this hatched line here is the ice edge. And you saw now from the other ones that this is exactly where the whales were in that period. The whales were feeding here on this ice edge. And what did we find? Now, here's the data along this track, this one, and then going back. So when we arrived, there was high this is salinity, temperature, and chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is these lines, this bottom one. This is the chlorophyll. And this is the chlorophyll. No, it went up to above 1 milligram a liter. Yeah, so there was a bloom over here, a phytoplankton bloom along this stretch. But then this is where the ice appeared. No, the hatch lines are the ice. This is this first contact with the ice. Then the chlorophyll went down. And then it stayed down. It was right down here. And this is the temperature and the salt. Right? And this is the distribution of chlorophyll at depth. Here you see that there was this one high value at the surface here. But otherwise it was down. It went down to 0.2, 0.1, 0.001 as a matter of fact, at depth. No? Okay, that's below the mixed layer. But here the concentrations are 0.2. And that's an average chlorophyll value in the Southern Ocean. And during EIFEX, we went up to 3.3, 3.4. 3 times, no, not 3 times, 10 times, more than 10 times the average concentration in the Southern Ocean, in the absence of iron. Yeah? Okay, so this is what we had when we went there. And then after that, we did sections along here. We kept going north-south, along 10 degrees south, 10 degrees west. Yeah, so this is one of the sections we did. And this is the Weddell Gyre. Now, this is salinity. This is south. This is north. And here you see chlorophyll. These open circles are chlorophyll. This is the old days before we had computer drawing. This was done by hand. Right? So here, this is chlorophyll. And that the blooms were north of the polar front. Right? And in the region where there was ice, sea ice, there was very low chlorophyll, desert. Right? And it only went up here. And this is due to icebergs. So here, this is the section through the water column, and here we had big blooms of chlorophyll, phytoplankton, but this is all 0.2, 0.3, right? And this is exactly where the krill and the whales were feeding 100 years ago. Yeah, it's almost 100 years ago, right? Wow. Okay. Now, this is the classic HNLC. This is where we did those experiments, now EIFEX and so on. And this was at the polar front. So there we showed that it's iron limited. Now, this is just to show you a diagram of krill and how krill feeds on phytoplankton and also copepods and is fed on by a huge number of different species, right? And particularly whales. And krill is a very peculiar and interesting organism. It's very versatile. It's exceptionally versatile. As a matter of fact, with my experience, and it's the most versatile organism I know because it eats anywhere and everywhere. It's cute also. No? Krill is really, no? It's an exceptionally versatile animal capable of utilizing an amazing range of food sources. It can filter feed on phytoplankton down to 6 microns. It has feeding baskets, I'll show you. So this is its feeding basket. It can also survive starvation for over a year. I mentioned that, and it just shrinks a little bit. And starving krill can be cannibalistic. They eat their neighbors if you leave them together in a container. That's conserving resources. If you're going to, before you die of hunger, you eat the neighbor, then you live longer, and then the neighbor's genes also, and so on. Now, how much krill? A total of 300,000 blue whales were killed, no? Each 100 tons. And then 500,000 krill-based fin whales were also killed. 80 tons each, no? So there was a biomass of 70 million tons whale biomass. Remember, the world fish catch is 130 per year. And there were 70 million tons of whales, warm-blooded whales, in the Southern Ocean at that time, because they were killed. No? So they were eating about 190, or let's say 200, to 400 million tons of Antarctic krill annually, these whales. No? And krill take 2 years to mature, could reach 6 years. So the minimum stock size of the krill would be 600 to 1,200 million tons of biomass. Again, all these numbers are not telling you much, but you have to relate them. No? And the biomass of 1.2 gigatons, this 1,200, is equivalent to 0.12 gigatons carbon, which is in the same range as global livestock and human biomass. Human biomass is 0.06 gigatons carbon. Remember that diagram I showed you of biomass? It's coming. Just to put you in relation, right? So the total amount of livestock, meaning all the cattle, all the chicken and pigs and everything, is about the same as the stock of the krill in the Southern Ocean alone. And in that area where the whales were feeding, it's not even the whole Southern Ocean. Right? And in an area, let's see, what is the area of that? No? You saw that ice match? The extent of the ice is 18 million square kilometers. And the summer ice is 1.2 or something million square kilometers. So if you assume 2 million square kilometers, a generous estimate, no, of the former whaling grounds, the average krill density amounted to 300 krill per square meter. Can you imagine? Krill is about this big, up to 3-4 centimeters. It's as big as the North Sea shrimp, right? And in a 1 square meter, you had 300 krill. Can you imagine how much animal biomass that is? It's a lot. And this is equivalent to 30 gram carbon per square meter, about double the carbon stock of a large diatom bloom. Okay? So there was much more animal biomass than that of phytoplankton. And this is, again, just to remind you, this I showed you already. No, the livestock is 0.1 gigaton. The krill had also in that range 0.1 gigaton carbon, just the krill. Now, of the arthropods are 1 gigaton, so about 10% of that is krill. They mentioned that in this article, but much less, because today's krill stock is much less. It has declined. Humans are 0.06. Okay? Now, this is a krill swarm at the surface. And krill also live under the ice. This is sea ice. This is a sea ice floe being lifted up by waves. So you can see underneath. And this color, these are diatoms growing in the sea ice. And krill eat those diatoms also, right? So this is krill scraping the diatoms growing on the ice from underneath. So they do that. But they also collect phytoplankton. This is krill in an aquarium. Ulf Riebersel took this photograph, by the way. He was on that cruise where we went. So they have this krill has collected this phytoplankton from the aquarium, right? And it's eating it, and you can see the food going through the krill here, and you see this fecal string coming out at the end, and actually it makes a loop and comes back. So this is one big loop of food. Okay, this is in an aquarium, but then this kind of behavior, this is gluttony, extreme gluttony, because it's not digesting this food, huh? Only a small part of it. So why is it doing that? Now, krill, I think I showed you this also. This is the gizzard of the krill, the muscle stomach. Chicken also have that. I don't know, they sell chicken stomachs also in the supermarket. And that's the same thing. It's a muscular stomach, but their stomachs have these teeth. And with these teeth, they crush the diatoms. And that's why the Antarctic diatoms are so thick and have such thick skeletons, because they have to withstand the krill crushing, right? So this is the diet I showed you already, this thing here. And this is from the inside of the krill stomach, or from the feces. They've crushed the diatoms with these teeth, inside teeth. internal teeth. So the krill have evolved to feed on diatoms. And the diatoms on which they feed have very thick silica because they're being selected for. It's like the thorns of the giraffe I showed you, right? Of the acacia. There's few leaves because you don't want to give the giraffe too much. And it's the same here. And this is also the krill thing I showed you already, no? Survival of thick shell diatoms going through the gut. And then this paper came out in 2004. It was thought for a long time that when the whales were removed, the last whales were killed in the blue whale moratorium came in 1964, that was stopped, no more. And the whaling moratorium came a decade or so later. And what happened, people expected that you remove the predator, the prey will build up. There'll be a huge amount of prey. But that didn't happen. The opposite happened. The krill went down. And now there's only a fraction of the krill biomass in the Southern Ocean that used to be when the whales were there. And this doesn't make sense to this standard system, right? So this is what they showed in this paper from 1976 on, right? So we don't have reliable records of the earlier years, but I showed you some of those from the 1930s, 20s to 30s, when this British ship, the Discovery, was doing this research because they were catching whales and they wanted to know what is like happening in the feeding grounds. So here you see how the krill biomass went down. And where was the krill biomass? It was mostly in this area, the iron-rich area. This is where you also have the phytoplankton blooms, and here not in the Pacific. And this is where the chlorophyll also is. This is chlorophyll, these are salps. But these people are thinking that the salps are taking the food away from the krill, and I don't believe that at all. There are other reasons. Why have krill stocks declined with their major predators? No? Productivity of the former whaling grounds must have been exceptionally high. An iron supply regulates productivity of the Southern Ocean, as we know. And iron entering the ocean is taken up by diatoms that then sink out after iron is depleted. But now we know the krill just go down with them. No? And if the diatoms are eaten by krill, the iron enters in the krill biomass pool, thereby remaining in the water. Right? The krill are feeding on the diatoms and they keep that iron in their biomass. No? And the former krill stock functioned as a gigantic reservoir of iron that was tapped and recycled by the whales. The whales were feeding on the krill, right? And they were recycling that iron that they had eaten. They were digesting the krill. They were taking out energy, hydrocarbons, right? And they were putting all the protein and the other elements, nitrogen, phosphate, and iron, were put back into the water. And that was fueling the diatom blooms that maintained the krill, right? In the absence of whales, less iron in krill was recycled to phytoplankton, so productivity declined, and ultimately the krill stocks. Yeah, does that make sense? So whales have liquid feces which promotes retention of iron in the surface layer. And here you see this photograph of a whale. It was taken by a captain of an American ship from his bridge. And this is a minke whale, and it's just turning, and it is defecating, and it's diarrhea. And since then, samples have been taken and they've shown that this is, of course, iron-rich. Obviously, if they're eating that much iron from the krill, that's going back into the system. And what is this? This is a bubble bursting. It's a whale of a fart. I've been whale watching off California once. And then you get hit by this incredibly awful stench. No, because the whales are also farting. And they have to fart at the surface because otherwise they can't squeeze it out at depth. Anyway, so here you see that these whales are fertilizing the surface water. No? And here you see this example again. This is a school of whales, and look at this whale. Yeah? So I wrote this paper, this News and Views, about whales, no? A whale-driven iron cycle in the oceans. No? And the Savoca et al. Showed that there was much more food being eaten by whales than we thought, and that would only mean that the whales were maintaining their own food supply. That you had the blue whales, which is just one species, and then you had krill, which is also just one species. The krill is very versatile, so it combines many species in its pool, you can imagine, right? But this two species interaction led to the largest animal that the planet has seen up to now, the blue whale, right? And the blue whale is not only the largest animal, interestingly, it's also it's a female, right? The biggest animal, the females are much bigger than the males by about 10% to 20% size. But the females are bigger, not the males. It's the opposite in the sperm whales. There the male is 1/3 bigger, the bull sperm whales. No? So here, what does that mean? It means that the females are also maintaining the food stock, the food supply. No? And reaching a deeper understanding of the ocean ecosystems that maintain whales might aid conservation efforts. No? Measurements of the animal's krill intake indicate that previous figures were substantial underestimates. And this was published exactly 2 years ago, this News and Views. So it's catching on slowly, the krill whale story. That it's the whales were maintaining their food supply. No? And then here is a paper, Southern Ocean Iron Fertilization by baleen whales and Antarctic krill. This is a colleague with whom I published a paper before. So they actually measured the iron concentration in feces, but it's not surprising there's a lot of iron. So what we can say now, okay, this is a review of a paper called Whales as Marine Ecosystem Engineers. Right, that the whales, they were geoengineering the environment, right, and maintaining these huge krill stocks. The highest animal density on the planet was there where I showed you where the whaling took place. Right? And it was maintained by the whales, purely biological. Okay? Yeah, you don't have to read this. But this is what happened with the whale stocks. No? This is the blue whale, the blue curve here. This is the Second World War. This is when the whales had a chance to breathe and recover slightly, but not much. Because then, no, this is the peak of the blue whale, and then they continued, and then here it was prohibited. But there were only about 600 whales left at the end of the whaling. And what did they do with the whales? They made blubber. They collected the blubber. The meat was made into pet food, and out of the blubber they made margarine, and particularly oils for lubricating the Industrial Revolution. Because whale oils were very good. No? And before that, they were hunting sperm whales. So that was for the candles, when we talked about wax esters. So when you think about it, no? And there were only a few countries that were doing the whaling. It was primarily Norway, right? And the UK was also involved, the US, of course. And then after the war, Japan, but only after the war. That's because the Americans, the Japanese were having a hunger problem after the war, so they were encouraged to go to the south and catch whales. And now those Japanese are saying it's our tradition. Yes, the tradition was forced on them by the Americans. And if you tell that to them, then they'll perhaps get off. Yeah, anyway. There were just a handful of nations involved, and of course that blubber was sold to everybody. It was the Norwegians were catching it, but they were selling the blubber because it was a very high quality lubricant that was not available at that time. No? So here again, you see this, the relationship between a blue whale, like up to 30 meters long, and 150 tons. The big whales were 150 tons. And I purposely used lower, I used 100 tons as a way when I said there were 80 million tons of whales in the Southern Ocean. Now that blue whales and fin whales. No? This is an elephant in comparison. So now imagine that this animal was maintaining its own food supply. Now the interesting thing about blue whales is they had this huge mouth. And how do they open this mouth? The whales, they don't have the muscles to open this mouth. And this whale is called mus musculus because it has so much, it's a very powerful animal. But that power is used to open the mouth. By the way, so these whales, they need those muscles not to migrate not to catch krill. How fast can krill swim? They need those muscles to open the mouth. And they open the mouth, they have a kind of a sense organ here on the tip, right? And when they need to open the mouth, they will open it slightly and then they'll charge. And it's if you have an umbrella and you run into the wind this direction with the umbrella here, then that umbrella will open like a parachute, right? That's what the whales are doing. So they have to target the krill. They have to know exactly where the swarm is before they open the mouth, because then when they rush that krill swarm, they have to also close the mouth in time that the krill don't get out again, right? And do you know that we don't know how they sense the krill? It's not known. They're not seeing it because they do it in the dark. They do it also 200-meter depth. They don't have acoustics. We haven't heard anything. So the people who have been doing this work actually on the krill, they don't know. They don't. This is another of those big mysteries. How do the blue whales, the baleen whales, find their krill? Now we know that, the krill swarms. We know that sperm whales have acoustics, very fine, highly developed. And I forgot to mention, that's probably the spermaceti plays a big role in that, no? In the acoustics of the sperm whales. Anyway, so here you see that these blue whales use their muscles to open the mouth. Now, if you look at these different kinds of whales, now this is a paper, now why whales are big but not bigger, physiological drivers and ecological limits in the age of ocean giants. And what I just mentioned is you have these sperm whales. Look at these sperm whales, no? And look at the jaw of the sperm whale. It always looks so puny. No? It's such a tiny little lower jaw. But why? Because they have to open it. If they had a big jaw, they wouldn't be able to open it underwater. This is where you have to realize that you cannot be a hippopotamus underwater, because you can't open your mouth, right? Or you need a hippopotamus, yeah, okay, but they're eating grasses, right? So not such a big problem. But all these whales, now these are the right whales, for instance. Now this is a blue whale. You see the size differences also. And now you also know why sharks have such small mouths on the underside, because they cannot open a big mouth like this to catch the prey. Okay, so now I'm coming to an end. So decimation of whales and the rise of people. Now this is the people going up and this is the whales going down. Total human biomass in million tons. And this is the greater whale biomass. Well, we're at 600 now almost, million tons human biomass. And the more whales feeding, the more iron is released to waiting diatoms, the more for krill to feed on, and the more iron is stored in the biomass between seasons. So now you have to imagine the animal populations as reservoirs of iron. No? Iron on the fin, so to speak, swimming around in the ocean and feeding on the krill, and the krill is also an iron reservoir. Of course, the main iron reservoir is krill. And these biologically stabilized ecosystems will be less affected by physically driven changes like of the El Nino, because they're independent. Because it was such a stable system, those whales could get bigger and bigger, and the more, the merrier. No? The length of the stable relationship between blue whales and ravenous, omnivorous euphausids is reflected in their evolutionary history. Or why would blue whales feed exclusively on just this zooplankton? They fed only on euphausids. All the blue whales worldwide, they only eat euphausids. The fin whales also eat small fish, and also amphipods, the fin whales. They're also closely related to blue whales, but the blue whales only eat euphausids, also of California, wherever they are, in the North Atlantic, also the blue whale populations. They only eat euphausids. No? And there are relatively few species of euphausids throughout the world ocean. No? So low biomass, iron-depleted, microbial-dominated, degraded ecosystems today characterize the Southern Ocean. So after we removed the krill and the whales, those ecosystems collapsed. So people who say hands off the ocean, they are protecting degraded ecosystems. Ecosystems that are not at all like they used to be when these big animals were there. And now I believe that we have to help these animals come back up again. No? The conclusions, the simple food chain of the giants, krill, whales, no? Giant diatoms, krill, whales is maintained by the giants. This is the biggest diatoms. The krill is the biggest euphosin. Whales are the biggest animals on the planet. And whales are top predators, so their population size will be food regulated. And populations of large, long-lived animals will stabilize the system on which they depend. And it is doubtful that the few surviving blue whales will be able to re-establish the system from which they were slaughtered. There are less than 3,000 blue whales left. And they haven't increased. There were 600 when the whaling was stopped, and they've only got to about 3,000. The fin whales have increased a bit more, but there were also more that survived. But they also have alternative food sources. Now they also eat fish. Right? So the fin whales are coming back slightly, slowly, but the blue whales hardly. And artificial iron fertilization will be one way to speed up the process. We will be mimicking the whales. We will be doing what the whales were doing. And it will be the marine equivalent of ecosystem restoration and maintenance. And I think that we as humans who now understand this, who did the damage, have the duty, like we did in national parks, to bring the whales back again. Huh? It comes to mind, National Park in India, in Gujarat, where the last Asiatic lions live. And so, yeah, go on, could you see what you said?
So for this, you'll also need to do the iron fertilization in the areas that these whales feed, the feeding grounds?
Exactly. We would start doing the fertilization exactly there where the whaling grounds were. Those are very reliable data. By the way, all this stuff is based on very solid data. We know exactly how many whales were killed, we know where they were killed, and we know that if they were killed there, they were feeding there, and we know how much food they were eating, and we also even know from the krill distribution of that time, that's where the krill also were. No, the sea was red with krill.